Callous Mayor abandoned his blind daughter with a reclusive homesteader, but he recognized her true sight. Before we dive into the story, don't forget to like the video and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. The wind swept down from the jagged peaks of the Montana Territory, a constant, sighing presence that carried the clean, sharp scent of pine and the promise of an early, unforgiving winter. Late autumn sunlight, thin and gold, cast long, skeletal shadows across the valley where Silas Blackwood's homestead sat nestled against the foothills. The world here was vast and silent, broken only by dark stands of timber, the distant glint of a creek, and the imposing mountains that held the sky captive. Silas stood beside his woodshed, the worn hickory handle of his axe slick in his grip. The blade bit into a round of pine with a satisfying thwack, splitting it clean. He'd been at this since dawn, the rhythmic labor a balm for the restless quiet in his mind. Each swing was a practiced, powerful motion that required no thought, only muscle and breath. His right hand was scarred, the tip of his index finger sheared off clean, a permanent reminder of the mind collapse that had taken his brother and shattered his own nerve almost a decade ago. He didn't dwell on the ghost pain. He didn't dwell on much. Silas lived alone on this land. Had for 8 years. He kept a small herd of goats for milk and cheese, a stoic mule named Jed, and a sleek gray tomcat he called Shadow, who appeared for food and warmth on his own terms. Most days passed in a profound silence that Silas had come to depend on, a fortress against a world that had taken everything from him. After the mine, after his wife, Martha, and the son they never got to name were stolen by the same fever that had ravaged the valley, he'd stopped seeking company or conversation. He just woke, worked, ate, and slept. His life was a collection of necessities, a warm fire, a full belly, a sturdy roof. Everything else was a ghost. When he heard the carriage, he didn't stop at first. The sound was an intrusion, a violation of the day's quiet symphony. The formal rattle of polished wheels and the high-stepping gait of fine horses was a sound that belonged to town, to money, to men he had no wish to see. He paused mid-swing, head tilted, listening as it struggled up the rutted track to his cabin. When it finally came into view, a gleaming black carriage that seemed to suck the light from the air, Silas recognized the man holding the reins. Mayor Thompson. His shoulders, broad and powerful from years of labor, tensed. Thompson was the most powerful man in the nearest town of Jasper Creek, a man whose ambition was as vast as the territory itself, and whose smile never reached his cold, calculating eyes. He was built thick, with a silver mustache he kept meticulously trimmed, a small vanity that seemed absurd in this rugged country. He ran the town like a personal fiefdom, and Silas wanted no part of it. The unspoken arrangement was one of mutual avoidance. Silas set the axe down carefully into the chopping block and waited, his face a mask of neutrality. Mayor Thompson didn't climb down right away. He set the brake with a sharp tug, letting the horses blow and stamp. He leaned an elbow on his knee, surveying Silas's small, rugged homestead, the sturdy but unpainted cabin, the neat stacks of firewood, the fenced goat pen, with a look of faint disdain. Behind him, inside the carriage, sat a young woman. She was perfectly still, a statue carved from ivory, her hands folded in the lap of a simple but well-made dark blue wool dress. Her face was turned not towards the stunning view, but slightly upward, her head cocked as if listening to a conversation on the wind. Her hair, the color of dark honey, was braided neatly down her back, but a few rebellious strands had escaped to frame a face that was pale and finely sculpted, with a mouth that looked like it had forgotten how to smile. "Blackwood," Thompson said, his voice booming into the crisp air, a politician's voice meant to fill halls. "Thought I'd pay a visit. Heard you might be in need of a helping hand." Silas didn't reply. His gaze remained steady, unblinking. It was a look that had unnerved more than one man in Jasper Creek. Thompson gestured with his thumb toward the woman in the carriage, his movement casual, dismissive. "My daughter, Eleanor. You may remember her." Silas recalled a younger version of her from years ago, a girl with bright, laughing eyes, chasing butterflies in the town square. That was before the fever had swept through the valley, a relentless fire that had consumed his own family and left its scars on countless others. "The fever took her sight," the mayor stated, the words delivered with the same emotional weight as a crop report. "Been blind for 3 years. She's 21 now. No use to anyone, really. Can't marry her off to anyone of standing, and my wife, well, she finds the whole situation trying." He let out a short, humorless laugh that didn't stir the air. "A man like you out here alone. You could use some domestic help. You've got no one." She's got no one. A neat solution, wouldn't you say? Still, Silas said nothing. He could feel the young woman's presence, a stillness so absolute it felt like a form of defiance. It wasn't the placid stillness of surrender, but the intense, coiled quiet of someone listening with every fiber of their being, absorbing the world through senses he could only guess at. The mayor finally climbed down, his polished boots sinking slightly into the soft earth, a look of annoyance on his face. No obligation, of course. Just a charitable thought. A Christian duty, you might say. Silas looked at him then, his eyes as hard and gray as river stone. You rode all this way to discard your daughter. The words were not an accusation, but a simple statement of fact. She's fed, she's clean, and she's not hard on the eyes, if you catch my meaning, Thompson said with a dismissive wave. She can cook and sew. Better she's of use to someone than a burden to her mother. Silas's jaw tightened, a muscle flexing along the hard line of it. He took a few slow, deliberate steps until he stood by the carriage door. He didn't look at the mayor, but at Eleanor. Her head was turned in his direction now, her unseeing eyes a startling shade of gray-blue, like a winter sky just before a storm. He saw the tension in her jaw, the way her hands were clenched into small, white-knuckled fists in her lap. She was a spring wound too tight. "Do you wish to be here?" Silas asked. His voice was low, rough from disuse, meant only for her. She flinched almost imperceptibly at the direct question, the first he imagined she'd been asked in a long time. She took a shallow breath, her pale throat working. Inside her, a war was being fought. Stay in the gilded cage she knew, with its polite cruelties and suffocating pity, or step into this vast, frightening unknown with a man who looked as wild as the mountains themselves. After a long, silent moment that stretched into an eternity, she gave a single, sharp nod. "Yes," she whispered, the word barely audible, but as firm and clear as a bell. That was all he needed. Silas turned without another word and walked toward his cabin. The mayor let out a bark of laughter, a sound of genuine surprise. "Taking her just like that? Don't you want to haggle?" Silas ignored him. He went into the cabin and returned a moment later. He simply opened the carriage door and held out his scarred, calloused hand. "The ground is uneven here," he said, his voice still low. "I will guide you." Eleanor listened to the sound of his voice, mapping its location. Then her hand, small and cool, found his. She didn't stumble. She rose with a quiet grace born of long practice, and allowed him to lead her. The feeling of his hand was startling, rough and warm, solid as the earth beneath her feet. He guided her one step at a time, up the 2 porch steps and into the cabin. The inside was a world of new sensations for her. The air was thick with the smell of wood smoke, old leather, and something else, the faint, clean scent of dried herbs. The floorboards creaked under her feet, each one a different note. He led her to a chair by the hearth. "Sit," he said, and she did, her back ramrod straight as he released her hand. He watched her for a second, a silent, unreadable appraisal. Then he turned and walked back outside. By the time he reached the porch, the carriage was already retreating down the path, the mayor not even bothering to look back. It left a trail of dust and a profound silence in its wake. Silas stood and watched it disappear. Then he went to the barn, fed the mule, and continued his work, splitting log after log until the sun bled away behind the mountains. He didn't think about what came next. He just worked. Inside, Eleanor sat alone in the growing dark. She didn't move for a long time, simply listening. She mapped the room with her ears, the pop and settle of the cooling stove, the soft thud of a log shifting in the woodbox, the almost silent tread of a cat padding across the floor. A moment later, she felt a soft weight in her lap and the vibration of a deep purr. She tentatively reached out a hand, and her fingers met the sleek, warm fur of the tomcat, Shadow. She took slow, even breaths. She didn't know why this man had said yes. She didn't know what he wanted. But he hadn't spoken to her like she was an object. He hadn't touched her with pity. He had asked. And in her world, that was a language she hadn't heard in a very long time. The next morning broke cold and clear. The kind of silence that feels ancient, belonging to the mountains themselves. Silas had been awake for hours, moving with a quiet economy of motion that was second nature, checking his trapline along the creek, milking the goats, his breath pluming in the frigid air. The routine was an anchor in the unsteady sea of his thoughts. The woman in his cabin was a disruption, a stone tossed into the placid pool of his solitude. He wasn't sure if he regretted it yet. Her single, whispered yes had struck a chord in him, a flicker of defiance he recognized in himself. Inside the cabin, Eleanor was already awake, lying still on the cot. It wasn't the hard mattress that had kept her from sleeping soundly, but the quality of the quiet. It was a peaceful, living silence, filled with the breathing of the house, not the tense, waiting silence of her father's home, where every creak of the floorboards could signal an approaching criticism or a sigh of exasperation. She could hear Silas moving outside, the rhythmic crunch of his boots on the frosted ground, the metallic clink of a bucket handle. Each sound was a clear, distinct note, helping her build a map of her new world. She pushed herself up, her movements practiced and sure, swinging her legs over the side of the cot. She took a moment to orient herself, then moved with careful confidence toward the hearth, her hand brushing the rough log wall for guidance. The stones of the hearth were cold. She found the wood box by touch, the sharp scent of pine resin filling her senses. Her hands, sensitive and clever, explored the space, finding kindling, larger logs, and a small tin of matches. In minutes, she had a small, crackling fire started. It was a skill she had insisted on learning, a small piece of independence her mother had called unladylike and dangerous. She was kneeling by the fire, feeding it small sticks, when the cabin door opened. Silas stepped in, carrying a pail of milk, and stopped dead. He stared at the sight of her, competent and focused, tending the fire as if she'd been doing it her whole life. He had expected helplessness. He had been wrong. He said nothing, just carried the milk to the small pantry. He returned with a wooden bowl of porridge and a mug of steaming water, setting them on the table he'd built with his own hands. She heard the soft clink of ceramic on wood. "I can feed myself," she said, her voice even as she rose and made her way to the table. He grunted in what seemed to be agreement and stepped away. She reached out, her hand finding the warm curve of the bowl instantly. The porridge was unsweetened, coarse ground, but it was hot and filling. She ate it slowly, listening to him move about the cabin. He sat in the chair by the now roaring stove, drinking from his own mug. The only sounds were the scrape of her spoon, the crackle of the fire, and the steady beat of the old mantel clock he'd inherited. "Why did you take me?" she finally asked again, the question hanging in the warm air. He looked at her for the first time that morning, though she couldn't see his gaze. "You said yes. That is not a reason." "It was enough," he said simply. He paused, then added, "This place, it chews up people who give up. You didn't sound like you were giving up." She considered this. It made a strange, painful kind of sense. "You do not ask many questions." He shrugged, the sound a slight rustle of his coarse spun shirt. "Only when I need an answer." A flicker of something, not quite a smile, but a loosening of the tension around her mouth, appeared for a moment. Still, she did not trust this. She had been passed between aunts and housekeepers, all of whom grew weary of her needs. She had braced for more of the same, or worse. She ran her hand along the edge of the rough-hewn table. "I can be useful," she said again, her voice firmer this time. "I can mend clothes, shell beans, knead dough. I can scour pots and sweep the floor. I can do anything that doesn't require eyes." "I don't expect charity," he said, echoing her thoughts. "If you're here, you work. If you want to leave, I won't stop you. But if you stay, you have a place. Not as a guest." Her head tilted. "And what is it you want in return?" "You feed me, and I what?" "Keep your bed warm when the nights get colder." The question was a shield, a sharp-edged thing she'd learned to use to keep people at a distance. Silas's chair creaked as he stood. She heard his boots on the floorboards as he walked to the stove and poured more hot water into his mug. "I didn't ask for that," he said, his voice flat, without a hint of insult or desire. It was a simple statement of fact, and it disarmed her more than cruelty. Cruelty she understood. This quiet, non-judgmental acceptance was a foreign language. "I don't know what you expect," she muttered, her hands finding each other in her lap. "You'll figure it out," he said, and then the door opened and closed, and she was alone again with the fire and the cat. She listened to his footsteps fade toward the barn. Alone. She felt a tremor in her hands. She hadn't cried since she lost her sight. She wouldn't now. But she felt something shift inside her chest, something she had locked away for a long time. It felt like space, room to breathe. Later that morning, she began her own exploration. With slow, methodical movements, she mapped the entire one-room cabin with her fingertips. She learned the texture of the hand-stitched quilt on her cot, the smoothness of the river stones set into the hearth, the 3 nicks in the edge of the wooden table. She found a shelf with tins of tea, coffee, and salt, identifying each by scent. In a crate, she found potatoes, onions, and carrots, their earthy smells familiar and comforting. On a low peg, she found his work coat, smelling of pine, sweat, and cold air. It was a portrait of a man, painted in smells and textures. When Silas returned for the midday meal, he found the floor swept and a pot of water simmering on the stove. A small pile of vegetable peelings sat neatly on a piece of newspaper. Eleanor was sitting at the table, mending a tear in the sleeve of one of his shirts with a needle and thread from a small sewing kit she'd had in her pocket. Her stitches were tiny and perfectly even. He stopped in the doorway, watching her. Her head was bent in concentration, her fingers moving with a swift, sure dexterity that was mesmerizing. He cleared his throat. She looked up in the direction of the sound. "I found the potatoes. I hope you don't mind." "It's fine," he said, his voice gruff. He felt a strange unease. It wasn't pity. It was a reluctant sort of admiration. He had built his life around the visible, the tangible. She lived in a world of sound, scent, and touch, a world he barely noticed. That night, they ate her stew in a silence that was less empty than before. The stew was rich with carrots and onions, seasoned perfectly. It was better than anything he'd cooked for himself in years. Afterward, as the oil lamp cast a warm, flickering light, Eleanor sat by the fire, listening to Silas sharpen an axe head on a whetstone. "Will you tell me what this room looks like?" she asked softly, her question from the night before returning, this time more insistent. He stopped. The rhythmic shing-shing of steel on stone ceased. He was a man of few words, and this was not a question he was prepared for. He cleared his throat. "It's plain," he began, then stopped. That wasn't what she was asking. He tried again. "The walls are logs. The chinking is old and dark. When the fire's high, the light catches the grain in the wood, makes it look like a map of an old river. The hearth is stone, gray and black, from years of smoke. The table is rough. My wife, she wanted to sand it smooth, put a lace cloth on it. We never got to it. Tell me about the fire," she said, her voice a quiet invitation. He found himself describing it, not just as a source of heat, but as a living thing. The way the flames danced, orange and blue at the base. The way the light pushed back the shadows, making them deep and velvety in the corners of the room. He spoke not of what was there, but of how the light and darkness shaped it, defined it. He spoke for 10 minutes, longer than he'd spoken to anyone in years. When he finished, the room was silent save for the fire. For the first time in 3 years, Eleanor could almost see it. And she knew, in that moment, that this man didn't see a broken thing when he looked at her. He saw a person who simply experienced the world differently. And that, she realized, was a kind of sight all its own. The days settled into a quiet rhythm, an unspoken contract between two solitary people. Silas would rise before dawn, his movements a familiar score in the cabin's morning quiet. He'd return to find the fire lit and a simple breakfast on the table. Eleanor, in turn, learned the homestead through her other senses. She knew the complaining creak of the barn door, the different tones of the goats' bells, the way the air shifted just before a snowstorm. She took over the mending, her fingers deftly repairing worn-out work clothes. She began making cheese, her hands knowing the texture of the curd better than any eyes could. One afternoon, Silas returned from checking his traps along the creek, a brace of rabbits slung over his shoulder. He found Eleanor on the porch, her face tilted up to the weak autumn sun. She was sitting on a low stool he'd made for her, a basket of his socks beside her, a darning egg in hand. "There's a hole in the roof of the lean-to," she said without turning. "I can hear the wind whistling through it. A different note than the one in the main roof." Silas stopped and listened. He hadn't noticed it himself. He grunted, a sound of grudging respect. "I'll fix it tomorrow." He started to go inside, but hesitated. "The creek's starting to ice over at the edges," he said, volunteering information for the first time. "The water sounds different. Thicker." She turned her head toward him, a genuine, small smile touching her lips. "I would like to hear that sometime." The idea was impractical. The path to the creek was uneven, treacherous with roots and rocks. But her simple request lodged in his mind. The next day, after patching the lean-to, he approached her. "If you want to go to the creek," he said, his voice gruff to hide his uncertainty, "I can guide you." Her face lit up. "Yes," she said. "I would like that very much." He offered her his arm, and she took it. Her grip was light but firm. He led her away from the cabin, down the path into the woods. He found himself describing the world around them in a way he never had before. "The aspens have lost their leaves," he said. "They look like white bones against the blue sky. The ground is covered in their old leaves. They make a rustling sound like paper." She listened, her head tilted, a small, focused frown on her face as she translated his words into her own sensory landscape. She could smell the damp earth and the sharp, clean scent of the pine needles. She could feel the chill in the air and the warmth of his arm through his thick coat. When they reached the creek, he led her to a large, flat rock at the water's edge. "Listen," he said. She stood perfectly still, concentrating. He was right. The sound of the water was different. It was a lower, more sluggish gurgle, punctuated by the faint, crystalline tinkling of ice crystals knocking against each other along the bank. "It sounds tired," she whispered. They stayed there for a long time, not speaking, just sharing the experience in their own ways. As he helped her back to the cabin, her hand lingered on his arm for a moment longer than necessary. It was a silent thank you, more eloquent than any words. That evening, as they sat by the fire, she was unraveling an old, worn sweater to reclaim the wool. Her fingers worked nimbly in the dim light. "My father," she began, her voice quiet and even, used to host dinner parties for men from the capital. "He would make me sit at the end of the table. He said my presence showed his compassionate nature." She paused, her fingers stilling for a moment. "One night, a senator asked me what I thought of a new land bill. Before I could answer, my father laughed and said, 'Eleanor has no use for politics. She lives in a world of her own.' He meant it to sound poetic, but everyone at the table understood. He was telling them I was an idiot, a pretty broken doll." Silas stopped his work, which was oiling a leather harness. He looked at her pale profile, illuminated by the firelight. He saw the proud set of her jaw, the straightness of her spine. He remembered her father's dismissive words. "No use to anyone." "He was the fool," Silas said, his voice a low growl. "Not you." She didn't reply, but a single tear traced a path down her cheek. She didn't wipe it away. It was as if acknowledging it would give it power. Silas felt a surge of protective anger, so fierce it startled him. It was an emotion he hadn't felt since Martha had died. A few days later, a cold snap descended, bringing with it a biting wind that found every crack in the cabin walls. Silas kept the fire roaring, but the chill was persistent. He noticed Eleanor shivering, despite the blanket wrapped around her shoulders. That night, he went to the old trunk at the foot of his cot, a trunk he hadn't opened in 8 years. The hinges groaned in protest. Inside, folded carefully, were Martha's things. The scent of dried lavender and old memories rose up to meet him. He reached in and pulled out a thick, hand-knitted shawl of dark green wool. He walked over to where Eleanor sat. "Here," he said, his voice rougher than usual. He gently draped the shawl over her shoulders. She gasped softly at the touch of the soft, heavy wool. Her hands flew up to clutch it. It was incredibly warm. "It's beautiful," she whispered, her fingers tracing the intricate pattern of the knit. She could smell the faint, ghostly scent of lavender and another woman. This was hers. It wasn't a question. "Yes," Silas said, his throat tight. She was always cold. He expected her to push it away, to feel like an intruder. Instead, she pulled it tighter around herself. "Thank you, Silas," she said softly. "I will take good care of it." He just nodded and turned back to the fire, his back to her. But he had given her a piece of his past, and she had accepted it not as a burden, but as a gift. In the quiet cabin, surrounded by the howling wind, something new and fragile was being built between them, woven from shared silence, quiet acts of care, and the threads of reclaimed wool. Winter arrived in earnest, burying the valley under a thick blanket of snow. The world outside the cabin shrank to the path between the house, the woodshed, and the barn. For Silas and Eleanor, the cabin became their entire world. The forced proximity could have been a prison, but instead, it became a crucible. They fell into a seamless routine. He would handle the heavy outdoor work, his axe ringing in the frozen air, while she turned the inside of the cabin into a true home. The smell of baking bread often greeted him when he returned, his beard frosted with ice. She organized his cluttered shelves, creating an order he hadn't realized he craved. She could tell his tools apart by weight and feel, his herbs by their scent. She was not his helper, she was his partner. One evening, a blizzard descended, a howling white fury that shook the very foundations of the cabin. The wind shrieked like a banshee, and snow piled up against the door. Silas secured the storm shutters, plunging the room into a dim, flickering world lit only by the fire and a single oil lamp. "It's a bad one," he said, shaking the snow from his coat. "We're shut in until it passes." Eleanor was kneading dough on the table, her movements strong and rhythmic. "We have enough wood and food," she said calmly. "We'll be fine." Her serenity was a stark contrast to the storm's chaos. He found himself watching her hands, covered in flour, moving with such purpose and grace. In that moment, he didn't see a blind woman. He saw the strongest person he had ever known. They ate their dinner in the warm circle of firelight, the storm a wild beast clawing at the walls. The usual silence between them felt different tonight, not empty, but full, charged with an unspoken awareness. "Silas," she said, her voice soft, "tell me about your brother, the one from the mine." He froze, a piece of bread halfway to his mouth. No one had asked him about Daniel in years. "What do you want to know?" he asked, his voice strained. "What was he like?" And so he told her. He spoke of Daniel's loud laugh, his recklessness, his dream of finding a vein of silver, so rich they could buy a ranch in the sunnier south. He described the day of the collapse, the groan of the timbers, the sudden darkness, the suffocating dust. He spoke of digging with his bare hands, of finding his brother's still form. He held up his right hand to the firelight, though he knew she couldn't see it. "This is where the rock caught me. The doctor said I was lucky." When he finished, his voice was raw. He expected pity, but Eleanor simply reached across the small space between them and laid her hand over his. Her touch was gentle, but her grip was surprisingly strong. "You weren't lucky," she said softly. "You were a survivor. There's a difference." Her simple words sliced through years of guilt and grief. He hadn't been lucky. Daniel had been unlucky. Silas had survived. He looked at their hands intertwined on the table, his scarred and calloused, hers pale and slender but just as strong in its own way. He felt a profound shift inside him, a wall he hadn't even known was there crumbling to dust. He didn't pull his hand away. The blizzard raged for 2 days. They passed the time with work and quiet conversation. She told him about her mother, a woman who loved appearances more than her own daughter. He told her about Martha, about her quiet strength and the garden she had planned to plant. They were trading ghosts, making them less frightening by sharing their weight. On the second night, the fire was burning low. Silas rose to add more logs. As he knelt by the hearth, he felt a presence beside him. Eleanor had moved from her chair and was kneeling on the rug nearby. "I am tired of being cold, Silas," she said, her voice a low murmur. It was not the fire she was talking about. He understood. He looked at her, truly looked at her in the flickering light. Her face was open, vulnerable, beautiful. The honey-colored braids had come undone, and her hair fell in soft waves around her shoulders. He could see the pulse beating in the hollow of her throat. Slowly, as if in a dream, he reached out and touched her cheek. His rough fingers were surprisingly gentle against her skin. She leaned into his touch, her eyes closing. He was not a man of grand gestures or pretty words. His love language was work and provision and quiet respect. But in that moment, another language surfaced, one he had thought long buried. He leaned in and kissed her. It was a hesitant kiss at first, questioning. She responded with a soft sigh, her lips parting under his. The kiss deepened, becoming something fierce and hungry, a release of all the loneliness and grief they had both carried for so long. His hands moved to her shoulders, then down her back, pulling her close. He could feel the warmth of her through her simple dress. She wrapped her arms around his neck, anchoring herself to him. He was solid and real, the smell of wood smoke in winter in his clothes, the feel of his beard rough against her skin. Without a word, he lifted her into his arms. She was lighter than he expected, yet she felt substantial, real. He carried her the few steps to his cot, the larger of the two, and laid her down gently on the furs. The storm howled outside, but inside the small cabin, a different kind of storm was breaking, one of warmth and touch and a desperate, beautiful human connection. In the heart of the blizzard, two solitary souls finally found shelter in each other. The blizzard broke on the third morning, leaving behind a world of pristine, sculpted silence. The sun rose on a landscape of dazzling white, the light so bright it was almost painful. Inside the cabin, a different kind of silence reigned, a soft, settled quiet. Silas woke first. He was on his cot, Eleanor asleep beside him, her head on his shoulder, one hand resting on his chest. Her hair, a cascade of dark honey, was splayed across the rough blanket. He lay perfectly still, afraid to move, afraid to break the spell. For the first time in 8 years, he had not woken up alone. The feeling was so profound, so overwhelming, it was almost a physical ache. He wasn't just a survivor anymore. He was alive. When Eleanor stirred, it was to the smell of coffee and the feel of Silas's steady breathing beneath her ear. She didn't open her eyes, but a slow smile spread across her face. She felt safe. It was a simple, elemental feeling she hadn't known since she was a little girl, before her mother's disappointment had become a constant presence, before the world had gone dark. They didn't speak of what had happened. They didn't need to. The language between them now was in the way he placed a mug of coffee into her hands without her having to ask, in the way she hummed a small tune as she prepared breakfast, in the comfortable, easy silence that had replaced the cautious one of before. The thaw came a week later, and with it, a visitor. Silas saw him coming from a long way off, a single rider on a fine horse, picking his way through the melting snow. It was one of Mayor Thompson's deputies, a young man with nervous eyes named Calloway. Silas met him on the porch, his stance relaxed but watchful. Eleanor stood just inside the doorway, listening. "Mr. Blackwood," the deputy began, shifting uncomfortably in his saddle. "The mayor sends his regards. He says it's been long enough. He feels it's time for his daughter to return home. For a visit." Silas's eyes narrowed. "She's not a prisoner here, Calloway. She can leave whenever she wants." "He was insistent, sir. He said to tell you he's a forgiving man, but his patience has its limits." From the doorway, Eleanor's voice, clear and steady, cut through the air. "Tell my father I am home, deputy. And I have no plans to visit." Calloway looked from Silas's stony face to the shadowed figure in the doorway, and seemed to shrink. "Yes, ma'am," he stammered. He wheeled his horse around and retreated, riding much faster than he had arrived. Silas turned to Eleanor. Her face was pale, but her chin was high. "He'll be back," she said. "Himself this time." "Let him come," Silas said, and there was a note of iron in his voice she had never heard before. He was no longer just protecting his solitude. He was protecting his home. The confrontation came 2 weeks later, on a raw, gray afternoon. 3 riders this time, Mayor Thompson, Deputy Calloway, and another burly man whose hand never strayed far from the pistol on his hip. Silas was waiting, as before, on the porch. But this time, Eleanor was beside him, seated on her stool, Martha's green shawl wrapped around her shoulders. She was facing them, her unseeing eyes fixed in their direction, a queen on her humble throne. "Blackwood," Thompson boomed, dismounting. "This foolishness ends today. Eleanor, you will come with me now." "I will not," she said, her voice carrying with surprising force. Thompson's face mottled with rage. "You will do as you are told. I am your father." "A father does not discard his child like a broken tool," she shot back. "You left me here to be rid of me. You didn't count on me finding a life." "A life?" he sneered, gesturing around at the rugged homestead. "With him? A broken-down miner living in a shack. I gave you everything. A fine home, clothes, food. You gave me a cage," Eleanor said, rising slowly to her feet. "You gave me pity and shame. Silas gave me a purpose. He gave me respect." She took a step forward, her movements sure. "He speaks to me as if my thoughts matter. He trusts me. He does not see me as broken. Can you say the same, father?" Thompson was momentarily speechless, taken aback by her fire. He turned his fury on Silas. You've poisoned her mind against her own family." "She has a mind of her own," Silas said, his voice a low rumble. "You just never bothered to listen to it." "I have legal standing," Thompson roared, his hand dropping to his own pistol. "She is my daughter." "Then act like her father and leave her be," Silas said, taking a step forward to stand slightly in front of Eleanor. He wasn't armed, but there was a power in his stillness that was more intimidating than any weapon. Thompson looked from Silas's unyielding stance to his daughter's defiant face. He saw it then. He had lost. Not just this argument, but her. The daughter he had tried to shape and control was gone, replaced by this strong, formidable woman. The realization was a bitter pill. He spat on the ground. "Fine," he snarled, his voice thick with venom. "Ride out here with him. But when he tires of you, when you come crawling back to town, don't expect my door to be open." "I will never be back," Eleanor said softly. "And I will never crawl." With a final, hate-filled glare, Thompson mounted his horse and rode away, his men trailing behind him like defeated dogs. Eleanor let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding, and her shoulders slumped. Silas immediately put his arm around her, holding her steady. "It's over," he whispered into her hair. "Yes," she said, leaning her full weight against him. "It is." The sun broke through the clouds then, bathing the valley in a pale, watery light. They stood there for a long time, watching the riders disappear, 2 figures silhouetted against the vast, wild beauty of the Montana landscape. Spring came, and with it, a sense of renewal that was more than just the changing of the seasons. The snow melted, revealing the green shoots of new life. Silas built a small, raised garden bed for Eleanor beside the cabin, filling it with rich soil from the creek bed. He guided her hands, showing her how to press the tiny seeds into the earth. She spent hours there, her fingers in the dirt, tending her small crop of herbs and vegetables. It was her own piece of the world to nurture. One warm evening in late May, they were sitting on the porch, watching the sky turn from blue to a soft, bruised purple. Eleanor had been quiet all day, a thoughtful, inward-looking expression on her face. She reached out and took his hand. "Silas," she began, her voice barely a whisper. "Something is different." He looked at her, his brow furrowed with concern. "Are you unwell?" "No," she said, a slow, wondrous smile spreading across her face. I think Martha's garden isn't the only thing we'll be planting this year." She took his large, scarred hand and placed it gently on her lower abdomen. "I think something is growing here." Silas stared at her, his mind struggling to comprehend. A child, a new life, a future he had never dared to imagine. The ghosts of his past, his wife, his son, his brother, seemed to recede, not vanishing, but taking their proper place in his memory, making room for what was to come. He knelt before her, his rough hands framing her face. He saw not the blind daughter of a callous mayor, but Eleanor. His Eleanor. A woman who had taught him how to see the world not just with his eyes, but with his heart. He didn't have the words, so he simply kissed her, a kiss filled with all the hope and fear and breathtaking love that was blooming in the quiet solitude of their mountain home. The wind sighed through the pines, carrying the scent of damp earth and new beginnings, a promise whispered across the land they now shared. They had both been abandoned to the wilderness, only to find they were the wilderness, and in each other, they had finally come home.